Okay, I think we can start. Can I ask you all to please turn off your phones, put away your computers? The CVSP Common Lecture is an integral part of all CVSP courses. It's not only important in its common element, but it's also important because you simply can't graduate university without knowing how to listen to an academic lecture. It's that basic, right? So please put your phones away and just give me an hour of your time and your attention. That's all I ask. Okay, so good afternoon, and welcome to this third lecture of CVSP 202. CVSP core courses are designed to provide an interdisciplinary engagement with ideas that have shaped human existence across different periods and cultures through the reading of great books or classics. Now, the selection and ordering of these texts is obviously not neutral, because it is already a way of telling a particular story. Therefore, it should always be open to interpretation and even contestation. Why this text and not another? Why at this point in the semester? I'm sure you've thought about such questions and perhaps even addressed them in your sections. Now, my name is Dalia Jabara. I'm an assistant professor in the Civilization Studies program, but I'm also an intellectual historian by specialization, meaning I study the history of thought and the history of ideas. So I'm especially interested in these questions of canon formation. Why and how historians decide that such and such a theme or author is important or representative of a time and a place is precisely what I research and write about. And I always begin with the premise that history is a dialogue between past and present. A specific historical narrative tells a story about the past, obviously, but it also says something about the present. In that sense, it is important to stress that what I will be presenting to you today is only one interpretation among many, and I hope that your section leaders will explore other possible versions with you that you can compare and equally reflect upon. So let us take the case of the readings for CVSP 202. So far, you began with antiquity and philosophy, represented by Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus, as a philosophical background to monotheism. Then you moved to early Christianity, embodied by St. Augustine, and now you have arrived at this week's readings, something on your syllabus that is called Classical Islamic Thought, featuring Ikhwan Safa and Al-Ghazali. The selection of texts and themes is obviously already full of meaning. To begin with, it seeks to create connections between these texts. The terms themselves are also full of meaning. The idea of classical Islamic thought is usually meant to refer to a certain period, broadly the 9th to the 10th centuries of the Common Era, as a golden age of sorts, al-asr al-dhahabi lil-Islam. This is a time when Islam's essential features and greatest contributions to human civilization were said to be made. After this period, Islamic thought and civilization are said to have entered a long period of decline or inhitat until the more recent efforts at European-led modernization that begin in the late 19th century. Now this paradigm of a golden age followed by centuries of decline until you suddenly get European-inspired modern projects is deeply problematic, and I would like to begin from a different point of departure today. Rather than having to define what's classical about the thought of Ikhwan al-Safa and Al-Ghazali, I would like us to think of them instead as classics of Islamic thought, forcing us, in other words, to reflect on how and why they speak to us today. For what else is a classic other than a connecting thread between the past, however distant and different, and the present, however joyful or bleak? My main question to you then is, do we read Ikhwan al-Safa and Al-Ghazali simply as representatives of 10th century or Abbasid period thought in Islamic history, or can reading them still resonate with us today? Can we find something stimulating and interesting in them today? In order to help us with this problem, I want to introduce you to two important ideas that will frame the rest of my lecture and my engagement with these texts. Late antiquity and Islam as a tradition. Now, these ideas are complex, they're theoretically quite complex, and they're difficult, they're dense. So please don't hesitate. If you have any questions about anything that I'm going to say, my email should be somewhere on the fly sheet, I think. Please email me for clarifications and ask your section leaders for clarifications and try and use these frameworks to think of the texts as you're reading them, okay? So, late antiquity. The first question we are faced with when studying a text is to identify its context, the time, place, and cultural world of its writing. In our case here, this begins inevitably with the revelation of the Quran. Now, as you all know, Islam first arose in a narrow stretch of the Hijaz, the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, but expanded with lightning speed into other Middle Eastern regions and beyond, as you can see from the map up there. The dark brown, obviously, is the Arabian Peninsula. So two broad approaches to the history of early Islam have been dominant. One view sees Islam as a specifically Arabian religion, and the other view argues that it was so deeply influenced by its contact with the established Byzantine and Persian cultures at the time that the Islam of the early dynasties, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, bears little relation to its original native land. These positions appear as opposites, but they share something crucial in common. They both rely on the assumption that Arabia is marginal and isolated from its surroundings. By contrast, more recent studies insist that the Arabian Peninsula was in fact part and parcel of that late antique world that stretched over the entire domains once unified by Alexander the Great, whom you may have met already as the famous student of Aristotle. This is a large geographical area crisscrossed by long-standing and wide-ranging networks and exchanges. In other words, we are not dealing here with the startling, almost incomprehensible emergence from the darkness of an isolated desert of some nomadic people armed merely with the sword and the word of a fierce god, as media would like us to think, for the most part. Culturally and linguistically polyglot, connected for centuries by trade routes, pilgrimage routes, imperial expansion and contraction, the world of late antique Arabia was a space where ancient thought and religions competed and coalesced with monotheistic traditions of various thoughts. In fact, one of our late colleagues in the history department here, Kamal Salibi, wrote a really interesting book arguing that the Bible, no less, came from Arabia. But without getting into quite such contentious or, let's say, contested arguments, think for a second of the idea that the Kaaba, the house of God in Mecca, is said to have been rebuilt not long before the Islamic revelation by a Greek, Egyptian, and Ethiopian carpenter. Now, the simple fact that we can imagine a Greek, Egyptian, or Ethiopian carpenter in Mecca in the 7th century, I think testifies to how connected the Hijaz was to the outside world. But it is important to think of this notion of late antiquity not just as a space of lived interaction, not just a space where people kind of hung out together and got on together between Muslims and non-Muslims, and that these interactions could sometimes be positive and sometimes negative. They involve political, social, economic, and cultural relations, et cetera, et cetera. It's crucial to also think of it as a space where ideas, concepts, words, ideologies, stories, and memories also flowed with ease. In this sense, late antiquity is not merely a chronological epoch, a period of time, it is an epistemic space. And what I mean by that, it is a space of knowledge making that shared common parameters regarding the conditions, the intellectual, material, and institutional structures that make truth claims or knowledge possible, okay? It is in this multicultural and multifaceted universe that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in 570 AD and in due course would oversee the founding of yet a new tradition, after beginning to receive revelation in his 40th year. Indeed, the Quran itself is perhaps the greatest single testimony to this diverse world of late antique Arabia, insofar as it consciously formulates itself as a continuation of an older universal message that was conveyed through a long series of prophetic cycles that reached their culmination with Muhammad as Khatim al-Anbiya, and is in both its language, the Quran that is, and its subject matter, a text that is continually in dialogue with its context. Moreover, in the course of the following centuries, in the centuries following Muhammad, a dedicated effort would be launched to make accessible in Arabic as much as possible from the intellectual production of the older traditions of thought. Often described simply as the translation movement, thousands of foundational scholarly texts were rendered into Arabic, mostly from Greek, but also from Persian, Syriac, Sanskrit, and other language, especially in Abbasid Baghdad. It is the cumulative effect of these developments that forms the intellectual landscape within which our authors wrote their texts. But the main point to keep in mind concerning this translation movement is that however monumentally important it was, and indeed it was monumentally important, it built upon already existing trends of cultural, religious, and linguistic intermingling, including pre-Islamic Arabia. So, to sum up our first crucial point then, Islam is not some bizarre ideology that jumped out of an empty desert and had to deal with the higher cultures of the antique world. It is part and parcel of that world from the very start. Okay. Islam is a tradition. Understanding the emergence of Islam as belonging to this world of late antiquity requires an appreciation of deep time and broad space. Requires an appreciation of the deep time and broad space that this concept invokes, given its emphasis on continuities with the past. The very idea of late antiquity, therefore, is an incitement to think about the shared commonalities of various cultures, texts, and traditions. And this is one of the ways that the texts we're reading today can speak to us, asking us to think beyond the all too common and simple notion of a clash of civilizations. However, we also know that Jews are not the same as Christians, and Christians are not the same as pagans, and pagans are certainly not the same as Muslims. So that it is equally important to recognize and explain the differences between and indeed within each particular tradition. Muhammad's project articulated itself as a distinct revolution, cut off in many ways from the past out of which it emerged, which it now called Al-Jahiliyyah, right? The time of ignorance. A very practical example of this would be the introduction of a whole new calendar, the Hijri calendar. We recently just celebrated the Hijri New Year. The first year of which begins with the immigration of the Prophet and a small community of followers from Mecca to a neighboring town called Yathrib, which would soon be known simply as Al-Medina. The new calendar marked the founding of the new Islamic community led by the Prophet, obviously, but it also marked it off from the other traditions around it. So simply folding Islam uncritically into some all-inclusive notion of late antiquity clearly will not do. It would both deny the originality of the new teachings and prove unfaithful to the historical sources and actors themselves. The challenge then is to find a way to make sense of both propositions, to juxtapose them in other words by taking seriously both the continuity and the coherence of late antiquity as a shared epistemic space, but also the radical break from the past that is involved in the affirmation of any new tradition. And this is where thinking through the notion of Islam as a tradition seems important to me. And by tradition, I do not mean the common understanding of the word as something that is old or unchanging as opposed to modern, dynamic, and new. Rather, I mean by tradition an arena that sustains in ways that are both conscious and unconscious a particular mode of life and a mode of thought, a particular way of being, a way of thinking, that ways in the plural actually, that are continually in dialogue with the founding texts of the tradition. In the case of Islam, the founding texts are first and foremost the Quran, the revelation, as the eternal word of God that predates time and space, but consecutively revealed to humans since the dawn of time, and the Sunnah, the deeds and sayings of the Prophet that were transmitted to the community as an authority and the central reference for how to live a good Muslim life. These two elements form the linchpin of Islamic tradition across the centuries, and they remain central to it to this day and central in the texts that you guys are reading. Now, what is crucial about tradition in this sense is that it's not opposed to reason. Often when you hear somebody speak about this is traditional, Oh, this is, we imagine she backward, she that's fixed in time, she that is dogmatic in its understanding. But tradition is not necessarily opposed to reason. It is rather the condition that makes rational thinking possible. It is through traditions, it's through the development of traditions and debate and dialogue that rational thinking becomes a possibility even. In other words, tradition is never fixed, like I said, or static. Debate and change are integral to it. And this is why questions relating to whether this or that is halal, haram, or makruh, disliked, are constantly negotiated in Islamic settings. From the simplest questions, such as, is smoking tobacco acceptable? Is wearing jeans okay? To the most serious and profound, is free market economics a good thing? What should our relationship be to the environment? What is the best way to reach the truth of things? And this is another way that these texts are classics and still speak to us today, for they demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt that tradition and reason are not mutually contradictory, so that the world cannot simply be neatly divided into two camps, an unthinking religious type and a thinking secular type. And it is precisely this that allows a certain continuity, an intellectual unity, even a universality of thought, if you like, from Plato and before to Muhammad and beyond, to stand in balance with a firm affirmation of the particularity and singularity of Islam and the preoccupation of forging a new ummah or community, defining who's in, who's out, its aims, its forms of being, of knowing, of acting, of making, of doing, all things that we can now call Islamic. Okay. Now, this balance between the old and the new has preoccupied Muslim thinkers in various ways from the very start. And it is this epistemic challenge that characterizes Muhammad's prophetic mission itself. But it would become even more acute and serious following his death, a foundational moment in the tradition, as the new ummah had to fend for itself without the direct presence of prophetic authority. And it would find itself extended further from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, a huge geographical expanse of enormous cultural diversity with which the tradition had to engage. Think about this a little. The same founding texts, the Quran and the Sunnah, will mean something both quite similar and quite different in, say, Senegal as they would in Indonesia. There was almost from the start then different positions on this fundamental question of how to balance the old and the new. And these are often framed with broad labels such as rationalists, those who appeal above all to human reason, traditionalists, those who assert the primacy of the transmitted tradition, legalists, those who adopt a legal or fiqh-based interpretation to the scriptures, to the Quran and the Sunnah, and mystics, those who emphasize a more spiritual mode of religious life. These labels are both helpful and problematic in equal measure. And again, you may wish to discuss this more fully in your classes. For us here, what is important to highlight once more is the common fundamental question that undergirds them collectively. How is knowledge, including pre-Islamic and non-Islamic knowledge, grounded in Islamic tradition? So, to end this section on tradition in late antiquity, we might pose the following question. How does one justify or legitimize knowledge as one perceives it in its immediacy, right? As one perceives it in its immediacy, as you apprehend it, but also as you receive it from the many pasts that follow. So you can have a position, or you can reach a form of knowledge through immediate apprehension, right, by utilizing your reason. And at the same time, you can receive knowledge through transmission across the ages, okay? Or to put it another way, what is the relationship between al-manqul, right, the thing that is transmitted, and al-mahqul, the thing that is reasoned or apprehended in its immediacy, what you might call interpretive knowledge? And I deliberately hesitate from calling al-ma'qul rational knowledge, as it's usually translated, because like I've been trying to say, there's nothing irrational about traditional or transmitted knowledge. Okay. The key question here, to put it more simply, is how do I know that what I know is true? How can I arrive at certainty in my knowing? This is what I mean by the term epistemic certainty that is on your fly sheet. These are fundamental questions of human existence, and it is because the texts you are reading this week deal with these questions that they're able to still stimulate us so many centuries later. So let's turn now to the texts. Ikhwan al-Safa. Little is known about the group of anonymous Muslim intellectuals who call themselves Ikhwan al-Safa wa Khullan al-Wafa wa Ahl al-Hamd wa Abna al-Majd, the brethren of purity, the loyal friends, people of praise, and sons of glory. Their importance stems from their having collectively authored an important work, an encyclopedia of sorts, in which they attempted to gather and classify all knowledge available during their time in the form of 52 epistles or tracts known simply as the Rasail. Sectioned in 4 broad subject fields, the epistles cover a wide range of topics and disciplines, from arithmetic, geometry, logic, physics, astronomy, magic, and natural philosophy, to geography, music, metaphysics, ethics, theology, politics, pedagogy, belles-lettres, and mysticism. Operating as a secret society, the members of this group met regularly to partake in intellectual pursuits and rituals that drew from a wide array of cultures, all in the spirit of brotherhood and mutual aid between a socially diverse collective of seekers of knowledge that saw themselves as united in a spiritual city, a mystical utopia of sorts which they called Dawlat al-Khair, the abode of the good. Beyond this, the Ikhwan remain very much an enigma, so that practically everything that we know of them is a matter of scholarly debate and speculation. This begins with their actual identities, which they deliberately kept secret, and extends to their intellectual, political, sectarian, and creedal affiliations. The speculation even involves such simple facts as the period and place in which they were writing, although there is now some general consensus that the Brotherhood were based in the cities of Basra and Baghdad in modern-day Iraq and were active sometime around the last quarter of the 10th century. By contrast, we know a great deal more about our second author. Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad Al-Ghazali is one of the most celebrated scholars of Islam. World famous already in his time, his imprint on the development of Islamic thought earned him the honorific title of Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, and the renewer, the mujaddid of the faith. This places Al-Ghazali among some of the greatest luminaries in Islam's historic Hall of Fame, and ensures his the continuing relevance of his thought and writings to the present day by both supporters and detractors alike. Al-Ghazali was born into a family of modest means in the village of Ghazali on the outskirts of Tus in today's northeastern Iran in 1058. Orphaned at a young age, he received an elementary education in Tus before traveling to Jurjan and then Nishapur, where he undertook an extensive program of study under the city's most celebrated ulama. Within a few years, Al-Ghazali had already begun making a name for himself as a leading scholar, a prolific writer, and an impressive teacher. This earned him the attention of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuks. The Seljuks are a dynasty that controlled vast territories at that time, even though nominally the Abbasids were the sovereigns. Nizam al-Mulk, who invited him to teach at the newly founded educational college in Baghdad, Al-Madrasa al-Nizamiyya. Al-Madrasa al-Nizamiyya is like, if you like, the Harvard or the AUB of its time, right? A very prestigious, very important institution. Now, reaching the summit of his professional career, Al-Ghazali suddenly undergoes a severe crisis and decides to retreat from teaching and public life. He reflects upon the reasons for this withdrawal in the text that you're reading, and there he weaves together a personal or a spiritual explanation with an intellectual one. Now, if you're beginning to see parallels here with Augustine, then you're paying attention, because both of these figures would come to represent a particular strand of philosophical thought broadly identified as medieval skepticism. Al-Ghazali abandons his position and family and embarks on a long period, over a decade, of aesthetic wanderings, which takes him from Baghdad to Syria, Palestine, and the Hijaz, and finally back to Tus again. It was during this period that he authored his most famous work, Ihya Ulum ad-Din, in which he reflected on the relationship between law, theology, and mysticism, and which, along with his early works on jurisprudence, and jurisprudence is legal theory, And his two main philosophical contributions, Maqasid al-Falasifa, in which he expounds the Neoplatonist ideas of the Muslim philosophers Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, and Tahafut al-Falasifa, where he sets about debunking many of their central tenets, secured his enduring legacy as both a highly revered and controversial figure. The text before you, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, or The Deliverance from Error, was written a few years before his death in 1111. He is reportedly buried in the Haruniya complex that you see up here in Tus, and that's apparently where his mausoleum still stands. Okay, so hailing from seemingly different backgrounds, experiences, and intellectual milieus, and separated by shifting geographical locations and at least a century of time, and an eventful century at that, our authors appear to represent two separate strands of classical Islamic thought. One, syncretically grounded in philosophical ideas and Gnostic spirituality, freely espousing an ecumenical liberal spirit of tolerance that blended monotheistic and non-monotheistic cultures and beliefs, and the other, characterized by an ambivalence towards philosophy and more concerned with maintaining a revised orthodoxy that wants to accommodate mystical and legal approaches. The variances are also clear in the two texts before us, which belong to two different genres of writing. The first is a literary narrative in the form of a well-known satirical fable aimed at delivering an ethical, ecological message, and the second, a self-conscious intellectual tract deliberating on the meaning and methods of true knowledge that is punctuated with autobiographical references. All of these differences concerning the contexts of the authors and the form, content, genesis, and reception of their ideas over time are, of course, important, and I suspect you will discuss them at some length in your individual sections. Here, I would like to suggest to you, keeping in mind what I've already said about change and continuity and the making of Islamic tradition, that these two texts ultimately share a fundamental unity as knowledge-making projects. In the time left, I want to highlight a few details that point in that direction before concluding with their implications. Okay, so the case of the animals versus man before the king of the jinn. In Epistle 22 of the Rasail, and after a brief introductory universal history setting the gradual abuse of the earth by mankind, the Ikhwan present an allegorical fable involving an arbitration, much like a modern court case, in which animals submit a complaint about their mistreatment by the sons of Adam to the king of the jinn. Humans and animals are both summoned before the king, and a jury of philosophers, poets, magicians, and other social misfits to present their case. The human spokesman begins by asserting, "These cattle, beasts of prey, and wild creatures, all animals, in fact, are our slaves. We are their masters. Some have rebelled and escaped. Others obey grudgingly and scorn our service." When asked by the king to put forward the proof or evidence that backs up this claim, the human representative responds, "Your Majesty, we have both traditional religious arguments and rational proofs for our position." "Very well, let us hear them," the king replies, and from here the drama unfolds, with the animal representatives headed by the mule, and the mule, of course, the Jahsh, is a very interesting choice of animal, begin to challenge each and every argument that the humans put forward. From the onset, then, the question of epistemic certainty, the basis of true knowledge, how do I know that what I know is true, right? And its relationship to both demonstrative proof on the one hand and arguments derived from tradition, from revelation and prophetic authority on the other hand, foregrounds the events that ensue. Interestingly, what transpires is not simply a sequential deployment of the two types of method in the arguments that are advanced by the two camps. So something like, here's my religious argument, and if that fails to convince you, let me put forward a rational one. That's not what's happening here, right? But rather, a seamless integration of the two forms. Demonstrative reasoning lies at the basis of the speech of both parties, just as they both always couch their arguments in references to the Quran and to the Prophet. So smoothly is this effected that at the end, the only point of distinction pivots not on whether using scripture makes for rational arguments in and of itself, but on the nature of the interpretation of the scripture. It's tafsir, in other words, and the extent to which it might privilege a manifest, a literal zahir interpretation, or a deeper, more esoteric or hidden meaning, a batin interpretation. Instances of this are tangible in almost all the arguments discussed through the course of the constant refrain, but only those who are well rooted in knowledge can comprehend. More tellingly, perhaps, is the example in chapter 5, entitled "The Animals Charge Humans with Oppression," which begins with an interesting challenge to the idea of natural slavery, the proposition that some beings are essentially and inherently unequal and therefore are natural slaves to others. Now, to debunk the human claim that their mastery, their lordship over the animals is natural and assured, because the latter, the animals, depend on them for food, water, shelter, etc., the animals deploy a new method of proof, a recurrent chain, a silsila of testimonials, one after the other, from all of the creatures present. So first the ass, then the ox, then the ram, the elephant, the horse, even the accursed and grotesque pig, who has the most to complain about. Haram. Anyway, this method of deducing evidence drawn from eyewitness accounts, extended over time, is well established in the Islamic fiqh and the science of hadith, of prophetic narrations. And it would come to characterize the very idea of learning in the Islamic tradition. Crucially, this method relies on the primacy, the importance, not of the knowledge itself, its intrinsic truthfulness, but precisely over this chain, this tawatur, this repetition, okay? And the chain itself needs to be composed, of course, of reliable and trustworthy speakers, a point which was also deliberated upon by Al-Ghazali in Al-Munqidh. These issues of method are again woven into discussions of other themes which the Ikhwan take up. For instance, the fable's location in the compendium. It comes under the section entitled Physical and Natural Sciences. And this demonstrates an engagement with Greek, notably Aristotelian, philosophical, and zoological ideas that would make their way into Islamic writing. At the same time, the fable is a satirical, a didactic, an instruction, a tool that's designed to instruct, rather. A didactic literary tool that is designed to comment on various aspects of the human condition and to admonish to higher moral ideals that are rendered in a simple and accessible form. So think, for example, of stories that your granny may have told you when you were younger, right? Al-Qurab and Nabi, the turtle and, the tortoise and the hare, right? Where the hare lies down and is just relaxed and the tortoise slowly but surely makes it till the end of the line. All of these simple renditions, these simple fables, are supposed to communicate a certain moral, right? Fables, then, are by definition able to cross cultural and historical boundaries precisely because at their very heart, at their kernel, is a deeper and more enduring message that is seen as a universal truth. In the case of the animals versus man, the basic message remains loud and clear. Humans must answer for the consequences of their willful and destructive treatment of the earth and its non-human inhabitants. But for the Ikhwan, this is just the starting point, for they're able to weave into their stories several other levels of interpretation, involving larger cosmological doctrines about the relationship between creation and the Creator, as asserted in the Quran, where man is enjoined to reflect on the reality of the divine through his ayat, or his signs. So that the ultimate fount of all knowledge is the divine who reveals himself in full glory. Likewise, the ultimate purpose of knowledge is asserted in the fable on two levels. The first is the earthly domain of happiness, harmony, and peace, and we see this played out in the fable's mediation on the nature of the just ruler, who is personified in part by the figure of the wise, merciful king of the jinn, who regulates through law and presides over a harmonious realm, and whose authority is recognized by both parties in the dispute. But it's also present in the disentangling of such things as the meaning of power versus submission, mastery versus bondage, tyranny versus mercy, truth versus falsehood or ignorance, etc. and whether these are essential attributes or whether they are instead accidental and ephemeral and therefore can be corrected through a conscientious program of social, pedagogical, and possibly political reform. All this is bulleted in your fly sheet, by the way. A second level that we might think of is the level of individual salvation, the ultimate end of the Ikhwan's soteriological outlook. Soteriology is another fancy way of saying salvation, okay? Soteriological outlook being the fulfillment of God's promise in the final return of all souls to their Maker. It is this in the end that gives credence to their insistence on friendship and mutual assistance among mankind in order to fulfill the trust, the amana, given to them by God, namely the earth and its bounties, as well as their covenantal duty to know and worship God alone. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. There is clearly much more that can be said about this fascinating text. But we must now turn quickly to Al-Ghazali, who shares these same three levels of interpretation. The issue of method, truth being contingent upon both demonstrative proof anchored in revelation, the question of the social ends of knowledge, and finally, the individual concern for salvation in the world to come. Okay. Not yet. Al-Ghazali, delivered in an autobiographical mode at the supposed behest of a fellow knowledge seeker, the deliverance from error is written in the first person singular and recounts the basic steps of the author's intellectual trajectory. The text pivots around a moment of crisis during which the scholar suffered an attack of severe doubt that led him to question the most basic truths, those derived from tradition, but also those from sensory experience and reason alike. Now, to those of you who will take CVSP 203 from the second sequence, you may want to note here the remarkable similarities of this part of the text with René Descartes' later account. Al-Ghazali's argument then examines and seeks to challenge what the author sees as three major types of truth claims, based on 1, theology, kalam, 2, authoritative instruction, ta'lim, and 3, philosophy or falsafa. These are not direct translations, but I'll also leave that to your section leaders. The first he dismisses, kalam, he dismisses as being merely defensive. The second for being unreasonable, and the third for being incoherent. None of these approaches, in other words, could provide him with a firm grounding for absolute truth. And it's important here to remember that Al-Ghazali's point is not to reject the conclusions of these schools wholesale, but simply to find an anchor for truth in what he describes as a profound and treacherous sea of knowledge. He draws continually on scripture and embraces theology, of course, and confirms the importance of the authority of an infallible imam, which for him can only be the prophet, precisely because of the primacy that he gives to the centrality of the idea of prophecy, which he dedicates a passage in the text to. Most importantly, he explicitly acknowledges the veracity or truthfulness of most of the propositions of the philosophers. The problem with them being rather, in his view, the dangerous social implications of their teachings for the untrained, gullible reader. Either total acceptance, including non-Islamic elements, or total rejection, rendering Islam ultimately irrational. Neither outcome will do for Al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali is only rescued from his skepticism by the light of God, whom he sees as the ultimate deliverer or munqidh from error, providing a solid ground for certainty and truth. The text, therefore, then moves on to extol a fourth category of knowledge seeker that's based on mystical experience and the primacy of the qalb, the heart, as what he calls, quote, the real nature of man's spirit, which is the seat of his knowledge of God, end quote. The Sufi way of life, Al-Ghazali argues, cannot be learned from simple study, but must be lived holistically and fully. And this explains why Al-Ghazali chose to give up teaching and live as an aesthetic wanderer for many years. The basic mystical insight conditions his approach to the proof of prophecy and of the availability of truths beyond pure reason, beyond pure rationality. Only this allows the grounding of knowledge, the resolution of skepticism, and the affirmation of belief, and indeed the reorientation of the very principles of everyday life, so that when Al-Ghazali does return to the normality of his previous life, he is radically transformed. He writes, you can see the quote up there, "In myself, I know that even if I went back to the work of disseminating knowledge, yet I did not go back. To go back is to return to the previous state of things. Previously, however, I had been disseminating the knowledge by which worldly success is attained. But now I'm calling men to the knowledge whereby worldly success is given up. It is my earnest longing that I may make myself and others better. I do not know whether I shall reach my goal or whether I shall be taken away while short of my object. I believe, however, both by certain faith and by intuition, that there is no power and no might save with God, the high, the mighty, and that I do not move of myself, but am moved by him. I do not work of myself, but I am used by him." The echoes to St. Augustine are palpable in this passage, but so too are the same three levels of concern that we saw with the Ikhwan: the basis of certain knowledge, its social and its salvational or soteriological end. Again, a reflection on the similarities between these texts does not mean effacing their differences or ignoring their differences, but it does help us see, I hope, how tradition works and how Islamic thought as a category can actually make sense. The concern for epistemological certainty displayed in the two texts and their mobilization of different integrated methods of reasoning is always pegged in the final analysis to the Quran and the Sunnah, the modular example of the Prophet. Then, this is what puts the Islamic in Islamic thought. And it is also in light of this imperative that Al-Ghazali and Muslim philosophers and theologians before and after him spent so much time examining and elaborating upon the meaning and proofs of the Quran and of prophecy. In other words, if knowledge is a deep and treacherous sea, as Al-Ghazali eloquently describes it, tradition is what anchors the seeker on her journey through this life and the next and delivers her to safety by God's will. Now, the task of reading and interpreting the texts in their details, I of course leave to you to do individually and collectively and hopefully repeatedly, not only for the purposes of this course, but like all CVSP curriculum, these are texts that ought to remain with you your whole life. But before I free you, I should like to draw your attention to a few broad pointers that are crucial, especially in this day and age. In other words, what makes these texts classics, in my view, worthy of inclusion in our CVSP canon? Firstly, both these texts demonstrate magisterially that it is unhelpful to think in terms of a strict dichotomy, a strict division between reason and revelation. The traditional division between al-manqul wal-ma'qul strikes me as a more interesting and fruitful point of analysis. Secondly, it is simply impossible, as a result of the deep and wide intermingling described above in relation to tradition and late antiquity, to speak of cultural borrowing or of a particular science, theory, or idea belonging originally to a specific group or people. What is more interesting is precisely to trace how ideas live and are adapted over time and space. And finally, and combining the 2 points above, when it comes to pre-modern knowledge structures, it is deeply problematic to imagine a monolithic or a coherent concept or sphere of something called religion that is battling it out against another self-evident independent concept called philosophy. As we see in the case of Al-Ghazali, even his supposed rejection of philosophy was wittingly and unwittingly philosophical, and in fact highly original and influential in subsequent philosophy, both Eastern and Western. And I hope that many of you will go on to do higher degrees here at AUB in philosophy, in Islamic studies, in history, in literature, etc., that will allow you to pursue these ideas further. To conclude, what is perhaps most inspiring and insightful in these authors, and if you are to remember just one thing from this lecture, if you ignore everything I've said for the last 40 minutes, and you remember one thing, it is the value of polymathesis. rather than the increasingly narrow specialization of our current academic tendencies and their strict divisions into art and science. I'm an engineer, why do I need to read Dante, right? I'm a literature person, I don't care what Copernicus has to say, right? Rather than these narrow divisions into art and science, Al-Ghazali and the Ikhwan were polymaths. They were scholars who viewed knowledge as an organic and complete whole, and who were accordingly able to discuss and draw on a broad range of topics and subjects to think through the issues of their day as deeply involved citizens of the world. This concern with an all-rounded education, incidentally, did not belong to Muslims alone, but was a feature of pre-modern knowledge full stop, including in Western Europe. What mattered most crucially was the purpose to which knowledge was put, and by extension, its ability to instruct its bearer on the meaning and methods of living a good life, its edifying function, in other words. Accordingly, the perfect man of the Ikhwan al-Safa, the man Al-Ghazali aspires to be, find echoes in the Renaissance man of European humanism, leaping forward to our own liberal arts here at AUB. Education is also about edification, and this is the very raison d'etre of CVSP. And this is why you have to sit here on this fine Tuesday afternoon and listen to me. Thank you for your attention.